Chapter 6. Reinforcements. Pete was the very definition of a city man. He had no knowledge or skills when it came to tracking people through the woods, but he was smart and observant of his surroundings. As such, he was now reasonably sure that the redneck was somewhere ahead of him. Mitch had taken the truck deeper into the canyon and discovered the cabin. He was waiting there now on orders to shoot the guy the first second he saw him. Together with Mason, they moved towards the cabin, hoping to flush him out or drive him into Mitch. Until Pete had reached the clearing, he thought there may have been a chance of the redneck had headed back towards the road, that they had made the wrong choice by moving deeper into the canyon. As soon as he got to the edge of the small field, however, he was certain he had made the right decision. Right in front of him was a small patch of mud. It contained a clear boot print that was obviously fresh. Additionally, the small clearing was some sort of tall grass. As a redneck had made his way through, he had left a very clear path of bent and trampled grass in a straight line across the clearing. Pete wasn't woodsy, but he wasn't blind. By the time they had reached the second clearing, again with another clear trail leading straight through, he was beginning to develop a better plan. He called Mason, who was still following the gravel road. He reasoned with Mason that it would be too easy for their prey to sneak around behind them and head back to the entrance, or he could just hide and let them walk past. So how bad did Mason really want to get this guy? He already knew his answer. Mason practically boiled with anger. He no longer cared about stealing the guy's money or ransacking his house. He just wanted the guy dead. Mason's pride and reputation was on the line. The redneck had seen right through their ambush. Mason had been punched twice, and in the face no less. If the other two had not showed up when they did, he likely would have been on the receiving end of a very serious beatdown. To top it off, the guy had stopped in the middle of the road and had taunted him, sat right there on the blacktop and blew his horn, daring them to try and catch him. Angry was not quite descriptive enough. Mason was furious. Pete then presented Mason with a plan. One phone call from Mason, and he'd have 20 men here in a little over an hour. Since it was summer, that would be well before the sun went down. He and Mason could stay put for that hour and make sure the guy did not double back to the highway. They had good visibility from where they currently stood, and Mitch could hold down the cabin to make sure the guy didn't show up there. Mitch only checked the cabin out long enough to ensure it was empty, but he didn't waste any time looking it over. He was on orders to stay put outside and make sure the guy didn't sneak through. Once their team showed up, Mason could divide them up on opposite ends of the canyon. They could converge together in a long line stretching across the deep valley and catch the redneck somewhere in the middle. Then, Mason could torture him or do whatever he wanted. Mason was not thrilled with making the call, as he would rather handle this himself. Rallying 20 guys for an assist was probably going to tip his father off that something was wrong. One of those 20 would surely inform Big Chuck, and you could bank that Mason's phone would ring shortly thereafter. However, in the end, if this guy got away, the cops would certainly be pointed in Mason's direction in short order. In the realm of law enforcement, everyone knew who Big Chuck and his sons were. They would be able to give a police sketch artist a clear description and a new focus with clear evidence that would allow the FBI to dig into their family. And, while the crime lord certainly had a significant number of FBI agents in his back pocket, he didn't own them all. Big Chuck would be far harder to deal with if the feds were sucked into this whole thing. Their prey was never supposed to have lived this long. They were going to take him back to his house, rob the place, and kill the guy along with anyone there. Brutal, to be sure, but it was how Mason chose to handle things. Mason grudgingly acknowledged Pete had a better plan. So, he made the call. 2 minutes after that, Big Chuck called. Pete's phone, not Mason's. A wave of fear washed over Pete when he saw the caller ID. Big Chuck was calling him? That was not a good thing. He had assumed that the boss would call his own son. That would, in turn, act as a buffer and keep him out of the crosshairs. But here was the most dangerous man he had ever met, calling his phone for details. He waved his phone over his head at Mason, signaling him that he was getting a call, and started jogging his direction to meet him halfway. He let it only ring twice before he answered. Yes, sir. Other end. Give me the details." Pete knew better than to not give a full account of what was going on. He provided Big Chuck everything, starting with the original plan and the goal behind it. He explained how it went wrong and laid the blame firmly at Mitch's feet. He explained how the redneck was currently the only witness and how they felt he needed to be contained in order for this to not lead back to the family. He explained the car chase and the Jeep crash. He told of how the guy had been trapped in a canyon. He left nothing out. When Mason and he converged along the edge of the clearing and Mason realized who Pete was talking to, he tensed up and grew visibly agitated. He said nothing, however, and listened as Pete gave Big Chuck the details. As he recounted the events, Big Chuck did not interrupt or ask any additional questions. He was just silent on the other end of the line. When Pete had finished, Big Chuck finally spoke. "Is that all?" "Yes, sir, that's everything." "Yes, sir, that's everything. Here's what I want you to do. You're going to catch this man. You're going to take him inside the house and kill him. Don't kill him anywhere else if you can help it. Clean up any forensic evidence of the scene. No prints, no DNA. Did any of you guys touch the Jeep?" Pete thought for a moment. No, sir." "Make sure. Wipe down everything that you would have touched, even if you didn't. Same goes for the house. Take the gun you used to kill this guy, strip it down, unload it of all the ammo from the magazine, and wipe all the parts and the ammo down for prints and DNA. Leave it in the house with the body. Find some gasoline and set the whole place on fire. The Jeep too. Then get back here. Drive the speed limit when you do. No more mistakes from this point on. Now repeat what I just said." Pete looked at Mason as he repeated everything. Mason just nodded as he listened on. "Good. I'm calling off the men you asked for. I'm sending you 2 of DS soldiers instead. I want this done right." Pete felt a cold chill at the news. Then Big Chuck said, "Put Mason on the phone." Pete did as he was told. He couldn't hear what was being said between the two, but the conversation was short. "Yes, sir," Mason said at the end. The phone went dead, and he handed it back to Pete. "Well, that went better than I expected." Pete looked at him and said, "He's sending DS? I mean, the boss doesn't play around." "He never does," Mason replied. They went back to their positions with Pete watching the clearing and Mason back up on the road. Pete called Mitch and filled him in on the plan. Then they settled in to wait for reinforcements to arrive. By the time it did arrive, it was nearly 5:30. They still probably had roughly 3 hours before sunset, but here in the Deep Valley, it would begin to get darker sooner because of the high walls of the canyon, so Pete reasoned that they had about down before lack of daylight became an issue. Plenty of time, he was sure. Pete had to admire the commitment level of the Kaiser crime family when it came time to kill someone. When 2 black passenger vans with blacked-out windows, loaded with guys and guns, came pulling into their position along the road, it was nothing short of inspiring. When they dismounted from the vans, it looked like a scene from an action movie. 20 guys, all dressed in black, wearing tactical vests, equipped with silenced M4 assault rifles and headset radios, all pouring out of the vehicle looking like they were ready for anything. At least 2 of them were obvious snipers, judging from the large scopes on their rifles. Their guns looked to be of a larger caliber, though Pete was unsure of what they were. DS was short for Death Squad, and they very much looked the part. They were seldom ever used to enforce Big Chuck's will, but when they were, it tended to leave a lasting impression. Big Chuck had long ago seen the necessity to have some serious hitters to call on should the need arise. So he had built his own small army. Over time, it had grown to just over 100 Death Squad members in all. This group represented only a small portion of the total. They were well equipped, and Big Chuck provided them everything they needed to make even the hardest of criminals tinkle on their shoes in fear. They were trained and seasoned as well. Big Chuck had business contacts with the cartels in South America and routinely sent members of his armies down south for training at a camp in the jungle. They practiced moving as a team, clearing rooms and buildings, setting up ambushes and defending positions. To keep their skills honed to practical real-world situations, he occasionally even hired them out to families on the East and West Coast. He had even begun to explore selling their services outside of the U.S. This redneck had no chance. One of them, clearly the leader, stepped forward, asking for information on what was going on. Mason filled him in on what had transpired, who they were after, and that the initial plan was to corral him in. While Mason talked, the leader pulled up satellite images from a map program on a small tablet and began to look at the canyon layout as he listened. After Mason was finished, he spoke. "We're going to make some changes to the plan," he told Mason. "It's a pretty good plan as is," he reassured, "but I don't want my boys shooting each other in a crossfire." He gathered his men around and started issuing orders. 5 of them, designated as Team 1, would head back toward the canyon entrance. They would stretch across the opening and perform 2 basic functions. The first was to look out for their prey should he manage to double back and avoid detection. The second was to radio ahead should someone else show up. Another 5, designated as Team 2, would head towards the cabin using one of the bow snipers would set up there and cover the valley when he was eventually flushed from hiding. They would act as spotters only and inform the rest of their victim's exact location should he emerge from the cover of the trees. The remaining 3 would head to the far end of the canyon where the last choke point was, marking the entrance to the final large circular-shaped box canyon at the end. They would not enter, but merely guard that position. After clearing the rest of the canyon, if the man they were chasing had already made it into that last section, they would enter in force and capture him together. The last 10 men, designated as Team 3, would stretch across the canyon at their current location between the gravel road on the north and the cliff wall on the south. On command, that line would move forward towards the larger area of the canyon and the cabin. They would push their adversary ahead of him or catch him if they could. If at all possible, they would capture him in the open and avoid killing him, saving that for once they brought him into the cabin. That would allow for containment of any forensic evidence. If they wounded him or killed him outside of the cabin, it would be increasingly possible to miss evidence that might later be discovered by the authorities. Most mercenary-type organizations did not concern themselves with concealing forensic evidence, but that's what helped make their group unique and very effective. They wore rubber medical gloves under their tactical gloves to avoid fingerprints and DNA from sweat. They wore tactical hoods that they could pull down over their faces in the event that they were caught on camera or seen by a witness that got missed. Their weapons even had small bags mounted to the side to catch spent ammunition as it was ejected. Additionally, once a weapon was used in the commission of a crime, the barrel and firing pins were swapped out to help eliminate tracking from one crime to another. Not only were they lethal, but they were clean. Pete thought, this is what he called reinforcements? Yes, sir. Big Chuck did not play around when it came time to kill somebody.